A statement that can be executed based on a condition is known as a conditional statement. In C#, the statement is often a block of code, and there are two different types. We have conditional branching and conditional looping. We are going to examine both of these types in this lecture. So conditional branching is where we'll start. This statement allows you to branch your code whether or not a certain condition is met. In C#, there are two conditional branchings, an if statement and a switch statement. So let's go ahead and let's examine the if statement first. So I'm going to go over here in my code, and I'm just going to create a void method. I'm going to call it public void conditional. So it's not going to return any value. And all of my conditional logic is going to be associated in this void method. So I'm going to put a comment here, and I'm going to put if statement. We've created this all in a separate conditionals class file. So we have it over here. It's in our models folder. And inside of this, I'm going to show you all of the conditional branching and conditional looping in C#. So let's go here and let's just create two variables here. Let's say int first equals 1 and int second equals 2. So now we have two variables right here that are initiated with specific values. And then what we can do is we can do an if statement that compares these values. So we can come in here first and say if second is greater than first. And what we can do here is type console. We can write out to the console dot write line. And we could just write some text out to the console. Let's go second is greater than first. And this can be the text we associate to the console. And then what we can come in here and say, if second is greater than first, what we're going to write out to the console, second is greater than first. Else, if this condition is not true, we can say, we'll copy this. And we can change this and say first is greater than second. This conditional statement is checking if the second variable, which has the value of 2, is greater than first, execute to the console and write out to the console second is greater than first. Else, if that condition is not true, write out to the console first is greater than second. In this case, in the if clause, this statement will be written out because second is greater than the first. So this is an if statement in C#. We can also implement else if. Else if is another condition that we can associate here, and we could put any value we want to associate to it, and then we can end it with an else statement on top of that. But in this case, we're only comparing two variables. We would check the first if conditional statement. If that is not true, then it will go to the else if statement, check that conditional. If that is not true, then it will go to the else statement at the end. So this is another way to implement that. But in this case, since we're comparing two variables, we're just going to associate it like this and just have our else condition right there. So this is if statements in C#. Now the second conditional branching statement we can utilize is a switch statement. And a switch statement goes through different conditions and it gives cases and it breaks associating with the specific case. So we can switch out a specific value and detect if it's a specific case or a specific value, then do such and then break after that statement. If it is not, then go to the next case. Switch statements are used also as a type to associate conditional branching in C#. So let's go over here. Now that we have our if statement associated there, let's go right here and put switch. And in the switch statement, let's create another integer. Let's give it a value, and let's call this integer my case. And let's give it a value of 2. So from here, I've initiated a variable, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put switch. And in my switch statement, I'm going to go right here, and I'm going to put my case to pass as the parameter right there. And now I'm going to build my case to associate it with my switch statement. So now I have to build all of the different cases that I want associated. So typically, if I'm going to come in here, I'm going to check if case 1, then what I want to do is implement some logic. And my logic I want to associate to the console. I'm just going to write out console.writeLine. And I'm just going to type 1. And that's what it's going to write to the console if my case, the variable my case, was actually the value 1. And then from there, I want to write a break statement. If the my case variable is 1, then what it's going to write out to the console is 1. It's just going to write out a string. Then we're going to do another case, and we're going to say case 2. And once we do case 2, let's go over here. Let's type console.writeLine. And we're going to just put 2. And then what we're going to associate with that is a break statement. So now, if case 1 is not executed based on the switch statement, so my case is equal to 2, so case 1 will not be implemented, then it will go to the next case, and in this case, this is going to execute because my case is 2. What I'll do is I'll create a default that if none of the cases are correct, it will implement this last case. So right here, we can write console.writeLine. And we're going to type out to the console, none. Once we do that, let's type our break statement. And this is our first switch statement. So essentially a switch is checking the conditions associated with the variable. This is how you'll typically implement this. In other cases, once you check the case, you may implement some logic related to methods. But in this case, it's going to switch my case. My case is the variable int. And once we have my case right there, we're going to check at the first case. In the first case, my case does not equal 1, so it's going to go to the next case statement, which is going to be 2. Once it goes to 2 and sees that my case is equal to 2, it's going to write out to the console 2. Then it's going to break, so there's no more execution. If my case was 4, then it's not going to implement case 1 or case 2. It's going to implement the default case associated in this, and it's going to write out to the console none, and then it's going to break. These are our 2 conditional branching statements associated in C#. Now we're going to look at the conditional loops that associate inside of C#. So C# provides 4 loops that allow you to execute a block of code repeatedly until a certain condition is met. You have a for loop, a while loop, a do while, and a for each loop. Each and every loop requires 3 things in common: initialization that sets a starting point of the loop, a condition that sets an ending point of the loop, and an iteration that provides each level either in the forward or backward direction. So in the first case, let's implement a for loop. So we're going to get out of this switch statement right here, and we're going to go over here, and we're going to type for loop. So in the for loop, we're going to put right here, simple for loop. So let's put for. And then what we're going to initiate is a variable associated with our for loop. So we're going to give it an int equals z, and we're going to initiate that to 0. And then what we're going to say is, as long as z is less than or equal to 20, and then we're going to put our semicolon, increment z 1 time. Then once we have that, inside of this for loop, we want to write out to the console every time this loops out. So let's do console.writeLine, and let's just put in here z. So what's going to happen here? It's going to go through this for loop the first time. It's going to look at int z equal to 0. And once int z is equal to 0 originally, then what it's going to check from here, as long as z is less than 20, we want to increment z 1 time. So the first value that's going to run through the loop is 0. Then 0 is going to write out, then it's going to increment by 1. So then z is going to be set to 1, and then as long as z 1 is less than or equal to 20, increment z by 1. Then it's going to go there, it's going to write 2, and it's going to do this all the way until z is less than or equal to 20. So this is a for loop, and it checks each condition as it goes. Now the second one we can implement is a while statement. So let's go down here. What we're going to do right here is we're going to just set an integer. We're going to say integer f equal to 20. Once we have integer f, we're going to write a while statement. So we're going to say while f is less than 20. We're going to execute this statement. So right here, we're going to pass console.WriteLineF. So this is going to check the condition first, and it's saying that integer f is equal to 20. While f is less than 20, it's going to write out to the console every value that is less than 20. So every time we're going here, we're going while f, so while f is less than 20, we're going to associate that and write that to the console. Now, if this value was 30, this would never execute because 20 is never greater than 30. So in this case, with the while loop, it looks to detect if this conditional is true or not. So keep that in mind when you implement while statements. It always checks initially if the condition is true. If it is not, it will not implement this. So always remember this when we're going from there. Typically what you'll do in this case, let's say we initialize this to 0, and we say that while f is less than 20 here, increment each time until it is less than 20. So this is how we would associate these values. But it's always going to check the condition first. If the condition is not met, as I stated before, it will not execute. In contrast, the do while statement is always going to execute one time no matter if the condition is true or not. So let's go down here and let's do while. So in this case, let's create another variable here, int d equal to 0. And what we're going to implement here is we're going to say do. We're going to write to the console d. So we have that here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to increment d every time this executes. So let's do d++. And then once we have d++, we're going to state the condition while this is going to execute. While d is less than or equal to 60. So right there, look at that. It's always going to execute at least once before it checks the condition. So in this case, since d is equal to 0, it's going to run this do statement. It's going to write out to the console the value. In this case, it's going to be 0. Then it's going to increment 1, which is going to be 1. And then it's going to keep doing that while d is less than or equal to 60. So now it's going to be 1. It's going to write out to the console. It's going to increment to 2. It's going to keep running this condition until the loop condition is not true anymore. So this is how we will implement the do while statement. Now the last item we have here is similar to the for loop, and I'm going to put it right under it because it's similar to it. So we could have here, we could say for each. And a for each will do essentially the same thing. It's going to loop through values associated with a collection or array of collections. In this case, we're not actually going to implement the for each. But I wanted to show you, instead of giving specific conditions by counts, you can associate this with a for each. Essentially, it's running the same thing. You can give some set of parameters to associate there. But in this case, as you can see right here, it will loop through a variable, give it an object, and then you can iterate through a collection of items. So for each is pretty much similar to implementing a for loop. In this case, we're not going to implement it, but I just want to show you that this is how you would implement a for loop. So let me go ahead and comment this out. So now that we have a for each, the last conditional, similar to the if-else statements that we have previously, you can do a very simple syntax to associate true-false associated with an operator condition. So instead of doing what we did up here, we can do the shorthand. So let's do shorthand conditional. So instead, we could come down here and we can implement our conditional and evaluate it with a simple shorthand value. So we can come down here and say, what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to create a little string variable right here. String value. I'm not going to set it to anything. We can initiate it with the simple value here. And what I can do is I can test the condition that I've stated before in my if-else statement with int first and int second. So what I can do here, I can say value equal to this condition. So I could say if second is greater than first, and then what I can do is put a little question mark here, and I'm going to say second. I'm just going to go over here and copy this. Instead of writing this to the console, I can just put this into a variable. And so I'm going to say if second is greater than first, then make this value second is greater than first. Else, I could put right here, and then I can close that out, and then I can say right here, first is greater than second. And you can see this is the shorthand way to implement a conditional. Instead of having to write it out if else up here, like second is greater than first, console.writeLine second is greater than first, else, this is an if else statement, but it's the shorthand, but I'm setting it to a value. So I'm saying string value, and then I'm saying if second is greater than first, this is what I want to set the string value to. Second is greater than first, else first is greater than second, and then what I can come down here and do is put console.writeLine, and then I can just put my value. So this is a shorthand way to implement conditionals. So we've looked at if-else statements associated with conditionals in C#. We looked at the shorthand conditional. We've looked at switch cases. We associated an integer switch case with different cases. Then we break associated with the statement that's executed. We looked at for loops and how the loops work. We've looked at while loops, do while, and we've implemented all of the different conditional types in C#. I want to thank you for joining me in this lecture.